All right, let's talk about some other crimes against the government. We'll pick up with the Espionage Act, which is also called spying, but it does cover a lot of other conduct as well. Focuses on crimes that are a threat to national security. These are the ones that are not covered by treason, which is very specific. And let's take, for an example, Robert Hansen was a counterintelligence agent for the FBI. He was assigned to detect and identify Russian spies. A former Chicago police officer, Henson, his assignment required him to have access to sensitive top secret information. In this is actually one of the most shocking cases in U.S. history. Hansen volunteered to become a paid spy for the KGB during the Cold War, and over a period of 15 years, he had received $1.4 million in cash and diamonds. He was arrested on February 19, 2001, after leaving a package of classified documents for his Russian handlers under a footbridge in a park outside Washington, D.C. During his years as a double agent, Hansen not only provided more than 6,000 pages of documents to the Soviet Union, but also caused the death of 2 U.S. double agents whose identities were uncovered with the aid of his secret documents. This case was subject to a movie. It was called Breach, and currently Hansen is serving multiple life sentences in a supermax prison. So espionage, that's what he was charged under, is the practice of obtaining information about a government or organization or society that is considered secret or confidential without the permission of the holder of the information. The criminalization of these acts depends on whether the acts occurred during peacetime or during war. And this is the act, the Espionage Act, that Julian Assange is charged under, and the Army Specialist Manning was convicted under this statute as well. And Edward Snowden is facing the NSA contractor whistleblower. There's a movie about him too that Oliver Stone did. Was also charged under this act. Someone else that the government is trying to get extradited back here. So let's talk during peacetime. It is criminal espionage to gather, transmit, or attempt to gather or transmit defense information. That's the criminal act. The mens rea is with intent or purpose that it will be used to damage the U.S. or assist any foreign nation. It is a felony offense punishable by prison. During wartime, it is espionage to collect, record, publish, or communicate information about military activity or to attempt any of those things with intent or with purpose that information be transmitted to the enemy. That is also a felony. Punishable by prison, but the maximum on both of these, doing either one of these during peacetime or during wartime, could result in the death penalty as well. So let's talk about terrorism. Despite its long history, it is often difficult to precisely define terrorism and to separate terrorist acts from interpersonal crimes of violence, like hate crimes. If a group robs a bank to obtain funds for its revolutionary struggles, should the act be treated as terrorism or as a common bank robbery? In this instance, defining a crime as terrorism depends on the kind of legal response the act invokes from those in power. To be considered terrorism, an act must carry with it the intent to disrupt and change the government and must not merely be a common law crime committed for things like greed or egotism. In recent years, crimes involving terrorism have risen in the U.S. and abroad. The federal government has enacted several criminal statutes, resulting in severe penalties over the years to combat terrorism. In 1986, the government enacted the Omnibus Diplomatic Security and Anti-Terrorism Act. In 1996, in response to the Oklahoma City bombing, the government passed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. And in response to 9/11, the government enacted the U.S. Patriot Act, which stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. So, for short, the USA Patriots Act. So the Patriots Act changed existing laws. It had also strengthened laws, and it gave the United States enormous capabilities and power to prosecute terrorism that's even committed outside of the United States. It gave the U.S. government federal jurisdiction over crimes committed outside the U.S., created crimes involving financial support of terrorism and terrorists abroad, provides the forfeiture of assets connected to terrorism. So if, money was exchanged or there was property that was involved, the government can take that forfeiture. There is several controversial provisions in the Patriots Act, to the extent of government surveillance, including its ability to snoop on email and intercept telephone calls. Border Patrol can basically racial profile. If there is a border within 99 miles, they can stop cars randomly. And they do. If you've lived in the North Country, you know that sometimes Border Patrol sets up stops on the highway and in other various locations because we're within 99 miles of the border. And that's very extensive if you think 99 miles down towards, into, just below, I don't know, close to Albany, out towards Syracuse way. So it extends greatly. Department of Homeland Security enforces the laws under the Act along with assistance from Secret Service, Customs, Border Patrol, the Coast Guard, and a number of other federal agencies. So let's try and define terrorism. We have two types: international terrorism, violent acts committed outside the U.S. that would be criminal if committed in the U.S., and that appear to be intended to influence a civilian population or government by intimidation, or to affect the conduct of government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. And then there's domestic terrorism. And that is the same definition, except that the acts are committed within the territory and jurisdiction of the United States. Acts that are prohibited: use of weapons of mass destruction, bombing places of public use, acts of terrorism across national borders, financing terrorism, harboring and concealing terrorists, attempt or conspiracy to do any of these things is another act. And providing materials to support for terrorists. I think I said that one. Providing materials to support to foreign terrorists and organizations, not just ones that are on U.S. soil. So these are the types of acts that are prohibited. On August 3rd, 2019, there was a mass shooting that occurred at a Walmart store in El Paso, Texas. A gunman shot and killed 23 people and injured 23 others. The FBI investigating the shooting, calling it an act of domestic terrorism and a hate crime. The shooting has been described as the deadliest attack on Latinos in modern American history. Patrick Cursus, a 21-year-old from Allen, Texas, was arrested shortly after shooting, and he was charged with capital murder. Police believe he was the one that did the shooting. Police believed that he had a manifesto with white nationalists and anti-immigrant themes. He posted online message boards shortly after the attack that he wrote that cites earlier Christ Christian mosque shootings and right-wing conspiracy theories. Another mass shooting occurred at the Gilroy Garlic Festival in Gilroy, California on July 28th, 2019. The gunman killed 3 people, wounded 17 others before committing suicide after a shootout with responding police officers. As of 2020, investigators had not really determined the motives of this gunman, who was 19 years old. Santino Ligon was his name. The FBI called it domestic terrorism, and that's what they were investigating under, domestic terrorism. However, and the second gunman committed suicide. The first man charged with murder. They're not charged with terrorism, despite the fact that the FBI opens a case and calls it domestic terrorism. These individuals who commit these kinds of acts on U.S. soil, they would not be charged with terrorism. They're more likely to be charged with a hate crime or murder or weapons, possessing weapons. Why is that? Because domestic terrorism, as defined in the U.S. legal code, but it's not codified as a law. It's defined, but it's not an actual law that can be prosecuted, and that's very confusing to the public to call someone a domestic terrorist, but then not charge them with a crime of terrorism, because there isn't a crime of terrorism. The FBI defines domestic terrorism as acts perpetrated by individuals and or groups inspired by or associated with primarily U.S.-based movements that espouse extremist ideologies of a political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature. The U.S. Patriot Act defines domestic terrorism as a dangerous act occurring within U.S. territory that violates criminal laws in ways that are intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. That definition also goes along with the U.S. government code that I just mentioned shortly ago. And domestic terrorism wasn't first defined in any code until 1992. Prior to that period, it was doubtful that domestic terrorism was even part of the public conscious or on the law enforcement radar. How does terrorism differ from domestic terrorism? The acts of terrorism that transcend national borders are actually federal crimes, and you can be charged as a federal crime under U.S. code laws, national terrorism. So it makes it different in that terrorism outside of the U.S. is a crime, but terrorism inside can't be charged due to how it is defined. So, how prevalent is domestic terrorism? Have you looked around about what's sort of going around in the country? Can white supremacists and other extremist groups be charged with some sort of domestic terrorism? Could they be considered terrorists? Some other charges that were filed in other domestic terrorism cases, that's what they're referred to. James Fields Jr., who intentionally drove a car into a crowd during the United the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2007, killed 1 person. The feds came in and charged with a hate crime, not terrorism, with a hate crime, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Robert Bowers who allegedly killed 11 Jewish congregants at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in October 2018. He was indicted on 63 counts of hate crimes and firearm offenses, as well as murder charges. He pleaded not guilty. He's still waiting trial as of April 2020. No trial has happened. The prosecutors are seeking the death penalty. And it's been described as domestic terrorism. Cesar Sayoc, who was arrested in October 2018 for mailing multiple explosive devices to 13 people, including Democratic politicians, was charged with using a weapon of mass destruction. Among other felony charges, he pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. They aren't labeled as terrorists pursuant to any law, but they are described as such. Some other notorious domestic terrorist cases: Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, faced charges of using weapons of mass destruction and murdering federal officials. It happened in 1995. He killed 168 people. He was sentenced to death, and he was executed in 2001. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was indicted on charges centered around transporting and mailing an explosive device for his decades-long deadly mail bombing campaign. He's now serving a life sentence in a federal supermax prison in Colorado. The words terror and terrorism do not appear anywhere on their charging paperwork or indictments, as they're called. How about, we'll talk about a case here. Terrorist case, U.S. versus Lynn. This is another federal case, and it involves John Philip Walker Lynn, who ultimately pleaded to charges of actually federal terrorism. He was charged with supplying in a number of counts. I think there was over 10 counts on his charging paperwork with supplying services to the Taliban. Give you a little background about Mr. Walker. In May of 2001, he's an American citizen, by the way. John Philip Walker Lynn, American citizen. He traveled to Pakistan to join a military training camp there. This will be the condensed version. Once he arrived, he trained to be a part of the Taliban forces. He said he wished to fight with the Taliban on the front line in Afghanistan, again with the Taliban against the Northern Alliance. When he finished training, he was sent off to the recruiting center, the Taliban recruiting center, where he advised the Taliban personnel that he was an American citizen and that he wished to fight on the front line against the Northern Alliance. He was advised by the Taliban that he had to complete additional training with a different group, and he did. He went out and did that training and did that through June and July of 2001. During that training, he learned about weapons, explosives, navigation, and he even was trained visited, and had the opportunity to speak and meet with Osama bin Laden. In July and August of 2001, when he finished his training, he was asked to take part in an operation against the United States, and he declined that offer and said that he was only interested in fighting the Taliban against the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. So that's where he was sent. And that's where he was carrying out his various duties during that time. He carried various Taliban-issued weapons, including AKM rifles and grenades. He was there on the front lines, but he did deny ever firing a weapon while on the front line. But he was there nonetheless. He arrived there shortly before September 11th. We all know what happened on September 11th, 2001. He claims that he did not know anything about that was going to happen, and he learned about it the next day on September 12th. Nonetheless, his group was captured by the Northern Alliance. He ended up being shot. He was being interviewed. He was shot, but he was alive. When he was captured, he was interviewed by 2 American CIA agents. Shortly thereafter, Taliban detainees overpowered all the guards, ended up shooting the CIA agents. But ultimately, Mr. Walker was captured. He was returned to the United States, and he faced a number of charges, as I read off. He did plead guilty. He received of terrorists, helping the terrorists, charging them with supplying services to the Taliban, but he was involved. He was an American, and he was overseas. So he was on foreign soil. So it was under the U.S. Patriot Act. The U.S. was allowed to charge him with terrorist activities and terrorism, which he was. And he was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison for terrorism and terrorism conduct. He served 17. He was actually released last May 2019. So he is out and he is free. He is still under supervision, parole supervision, or the federal version of parole supervision for another 3 years. But that is a type of case involving an actual charge where the Patriot Act came into play, charging terrorism of a American citizen and their conduct overseas. As I mentioned earlier, the Patriot Act has a few problems. It allows for government surveillance, and that is they are surveilling. Surveillance includes searching, and searching is illegal, an illegal search and seizure without a warrant. So there is some Fourth Amendment issues. There's also some First Amendment issues. It prohibits financing terrorists and terrorism, and that involves attacks of violating our First Amendment right to speech, our First Amendment right to religion, and our First Amendment right to associate. We're allowed to associate with whoever we want to associate. But under the Patriot Act, that cannot be terrorists as defined under the Act. And you cannot send money to terrorists. But we're allowed to send money, and support other groups, right? We can give donations to other groups and politicians, but don't let it be a terrorist under the Patriot Act. These things have been attacked under in 2004, a federal court did strike down an entire portion of the Patriot Act, provision that gives the government unchecked authority to issue national security letters to obtain sensitive customer records from internet service providers and other businesses without judicial oversight, i.e. a warrant. The court also found a broad gag provision in the law to be unconstitutional, prior restraint on free speech, meaning not allowing individuals to speak about terrorism. Remember our overthrow of the government conversation? So the government cannot go in to our internet service providers and say, give us all this information without actually having a warrant. That's an illegal search and seizure. And in some instances, relative to individuals who want to speak in favor of terrorism. It's against the First Amendment to restrain that kind of speech. So those are the only attacks so far, but there are a whole bunch of others relative to the Patriot Act. But all in all, the United States government is attempting to protect national security, and there is a fine line with trouncing on our constitutional rights in doing so. So that concludes the discussion on crimes against the government when we're dealing with national security. There are a few other ones that we're going to talk about in the next video.